Hello, my name is Jeff Sugg and I am a projection designer. We're here today to talk about the various parts of being a projection designer within the production. So we're not going to be talking a lot about content and making of the imagery today. What we're going to be mostly focusing on is the nuts and bolts of the design process and the interactions with other people in the team. So we're going to start by talking about communication. And that means communication with the director, with the other designers, and various departments within the production. And we're also going to be talking about where your interests and goals and design processes overlap with other people. We're also going to talk about the projection design team itself and the various members of that team and their roles. And then we're going to talk about the preparation that you do as the designer and as a projection team prior to tech. So that goes all the way back to getting your equipment lined up, making sure it all fits into the theater, and what drawings and information you'll need to have to distribute to the people that are loading it in, and all that sort of thing. And then finally, we'll just go over a brief summary of some of the major points and share some of my experience that I've gained over the years that might be helpful to other folks. As we get started with the communication, what better person to start with than the director? So the first thing that you're going to need to do with the director, assuming that it's a new person, is find a common language. And what you really want to do is probe a little bit and see how this person understands imagery, how they understand the use of imagery in theater, and what best serves as a language for them to discuss the ideas. And that specifically responds to content and stuff like that, but it also just has to do with kind of generally the aesthetic themes and aesthetic notes that you're trying to hit within the piece. And I'll also just stay really closely here. It's very important to establish how you're going to stay in touch with your director. Some directors only work with email and some prefer texts or phones. But you just really want to make sure that you have a clear line of communication with them. If you're used to working with texts and phones and they're used to working only on email, it's not going to be a very productive relationship. So you want to figure out what they do, what they're most comfortable with, and make it easy on them. The goal is to make it so that your director and you can speak easily, and the burden of doing that frequently falls on you and not them. So let's just talk a little bit about a common language as it relates to content. So what you see here are three different examples of content styles, we'll call it. On the left image here, where it says drawing and cartoon, this is something that I'll use where I'll just prepare some reference images to discuss the idea on a very basic level. So in this particular instance, we were talking about how to portray a rocky crevice. Can they look at simple images like this and extrapolate? Most of them can, but then you're going to want to take those simple images and then turn them into something more complex. In the center here, you see a very, very cursory, what I like to call a napkin sketch, right? So these are very basic geometric shapes that represent the panels of movement that the screen would be doing. You know, you want to know if your director can look at images like this and then understand what that might look like on the stage, or if images like this might just be confusing to them. You know, some directors are very text-based and they have a hard time taking images like this and moving on and imagining what they would look like on stage. On the right here, you see two different versions of the same setup, right? So on the top is a very simple pencil drawing over the screens, and then the one below is a more rendered photorealistic image that's a little more representative of what it might look like on stage. You know, the top is acceptable to kind of give the idea of the movement, and then the bottom image, you might want to get into that a little more when you're discussing what those planes will look like, what the rendering of the sky will look like. And so you have a really strong sense of the whole graphic of the sequence. And then you can go back to these simple pencil things to talk about the movement and the gesture and the rhythm of it as you move forward, knowing full well that the image on the bottom contains the information about the shape and the, you know, what the visual will look like. And then once you kind of have all this established and have a shorthand about how to talk about these things and what works and what doesn't between the two of you, then you'll obviously be sharing a lot of files. And so you just want to make sure that you have a strong understanding of what's the best file sharing software for this person. You know, if it's Dropbox or Google Docs or just simply emailing images back and forth. But you want to make sure it's a way that they are happy with and can quickly understand. And then it's something that you're going to be able to catalog the changes and take into account what you need to do as far as notes and stuff like that moving forward. As I said earlier, you know, it's vital that you make this easy for the director. I frankly don't think it's appropriate or useful to ask the director to change the way that they work in order to fit your needs or whatever established techniques you have. I think it's really important to make their life easier so that they are comfortable in having these conversations about the content and how it moves. And so frequently in having these conversations with the director, you're also going to want to keep a lot of people in the loop. And here's just a short list of some of those people that I've found to be very useful to, if it's an email to CC or to ask to meetings or to get into conference calls. But the assistant director obviously needs to know what's going on. If you're in a musical situation, the choreographer definitely needs to be involved because in some musicals, the choreographer is doing most of the staging as well. So they need to be very aware of the content you're creating and the structures and how it's interacting with the stage picture. And then obviously stage management and the scenic designer. So talking about the scenic designer, let's just go ahead and start talking about the other designers and how the projection designer works with them. Obviously the scenic designer will be a primary collaborator when you first come on board because what you're going to be working with is their larger design frequently and then fitting things into that. And so you're going to want to get a strong sense of what their overall design is, obviously, and what that aesthetic is. And will have been working with the director for a little bit longer at that point since they've already been getting this initial design together. And so they'll really already have a sense of what the director is looking for as well. And then that's going to lead you to what type of surfaces you're using. Are you using display devices like LED walls and TVs? Or are you using projectors? And are the surfaces screens? Are you doing projection mapping onto various pieces of scenery? And then as you start to have these ideas, you'll go back and forth with the scenic designer about finding ways to adjust their design, perhaps to fit the projections in better, or augmenting things or taking things away in order to allow the projections to feel more integrated into the show. And then you just want to make sure that you're sharing the research and the storyboards that you do with the scenic designer. Frequently, scenic designers in their first set of storyboards will have examples of projection ideas integrated into those images, and you want to make sure to take those into account. And then frequently, at least in the US, you'll find that the scenic designer is a sort of gateway to the director. Like I said, they've been in the room together a lot longer with each other, and they have a much stronger sense of what the overall ideas of the show are at this point. And so it's nice to be able to, confer with the scenic designer at the same time as you're talking to the director or before, and go over the ideas with them and then bring them to the director together. Here's an image from 33 Variations, a play that I did on Broadway years ago, and the scenic design here is done by Derek McLean, and you'll see it's a very striking, elegant design. All of these archival boxes of books everywhere with individual lights on them and sheets of paper surrounding the set. This show was about Beethoven and his writing process, so all of these sheets were composition pages thrown all over the stage. And it's very systematic, very clean, very architectural lines. And so as just a basic piece of scenic design, it's extremely beautiful and complicated. But then what we were able to do with the projections on top of that were then to transform that place that seemed kind of not stagnant, but of one place, and really help to redefine it. Splash projections all over the walls and have these text pieces of the numbers of variations going back and forth over. And we were able to really animate the space as these bookshelves tracked on and off, as the other pieces of scenery rolled around the stage. and to create a lot of movement during the transitions and during other scenes in the play, to take this thing that was very large and architectural and then turn it into all sorts of various distinct other pieces. Here again is a piece in which the lighting designer and I worked very well together. David Lander was the lighting designer on this piece, and this was a scene obviously that took place at the theater, and by using only a couple lights to light the actors in the middle of the stage and then washing the rest of the stage with a single projected image, we were able to make the entire set essentially vanish and draw these characters out in a way that you wouldn't have imagined before. Of course, it's essential that the lighting designer and I are working together on this kind of thing, and I had a wonderful collaboration with David Lander, and we were able to create these stunning images that you might not be able to do unless you were working together in a collaborative way. So that takes us to the lighting designer. In the same way that you were with the scenic designer, you want to make sure that you're going over the overall ideas and the aesthetic of your work in particular and the play in general. And what you're going to find is that the LD really is your most significant collaborator once you get into the technical period. You know, you're both working with light, that is your medium, and you're both working in color and texture and timing and in patterns and ways that other designers aren't really doing. So it's really important that you both kind of have these ideas together, and then you can really sort of take your research and the storyboards that you've done and start to integrate lighting ideas into them and really have a sympathetic relationship with those two mediums. You know, and issues of brightness become a problem or a solution very quickly for both departments. You know, LED walls are very bright, but projectors can be very dim. So it's important that you kind of play nicely and communicate together about what you're trying to do as individual designers and as a group of designers, and see if you can help each other out, because frequently you can, and if one is working with the other, the ultimate goal and the ultimate aesthetic choices are much more strong. And then this idea of substrates and surfaces, right? So are you using screens or are you projection mapping? And the picture here you see where I'm projection mapping all over the inside of this room, and the actor here, you'll notice, has some projection on them, but I was also able to use the projected image to light that actor. And a lot of times that's not really going to be possible because of the scale, but this was very tight quarters and it turned out to be much easier to utilize the projected image to both light the walls, do the image mapping, and also to light the actors at the same time. You'll see here in this image taken from Tina, you can see that we're using a large LED wall upstage in this show. There's also 4 portals that are lined with LED tape that were used throughout the show to kind of accent the size, and as those portal pieces fly in and out, you can kind of see the stage contracting and expanding. And what we were able to do here was to take the video content that we have on the wall and also play that through the LED tape using pixel mapping. So this allowed for the animation that was on the back wall to move forward into the whole stage surrounding the Tina performer, and made the whole image a much more cohesive, expansive picture. Obviously, this involves the coordination between the video and the lighting department, as we've been talking about, but it can be a very, very powerful tool. And then the transitions, right? So as scenery is moved on and off, as you go from one scene to another, whereas years ago it might have just been a simple blackout, a lot of work is being done by the lighting and projection departments now to turn these transitions into finessed moments of their own, right? So you want to guide the eye away from things that are moving probably and towards the scenic elements that are coming on stage. You want to be able to help describe the change in time and place and time of day. And all of these things are done by a thorough collaboration between the lighting and the projection department. You know, some people can be frustrated by the fact that we as projection designers get asked to do a lot of work during the transitions, but it's just a big part of our design at this point. It's a big part of what we're asked to do. So I found it's really just better to go in accepting that that's going to be something on the table, and to have a cohesive plan and work together with the lighting department and the scenery folks to make sure these transitions are an integral part of the show. If you've got moving scenery that's automated, you can frequently get timings of that stuff during the dry tech period, so you already know how long these transitions are going to be, and you can use those as framework guides for your content creation. And then I'll just take a quick second to talk about control. We're going to do another lecture that's specifically about the design technology and the projection technology. But it is important, since we're talking about communication with the lighting designer, to go over this. At this point, 99% of my shows involve the projection cues and the video cues being run via the lighting desk. Also, audio triggers our stuff, but it's mostly the lighting desk that is controlling our gear. So it's essential that you have a communication flow between the two departments for that as well. Here's another image from Tina, and you'll see the LED portal lights that I mentioned before, those 4 areas of yellow lines around the stage. And you'll notice that in this particular image, you've got an extra line down there at the bottom behind the band, and that is a single line that we added on the LED wall to add some forced perspective to this lighting look. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines that are made by the lighting department, and the 6th in the back is made by the video department to make the stage look a little deeper. It's just a simple way of adding to the lighting effect that we saw we could do, and it, I think, is a good illustration of departments working together. Here's another image from Tina that just kind of shows lighting and video creating a cohesive color palette and atmosphere that I think is very strong and powerful. You'll also notice that we've got the video surrounded with black edges, so you kind of can't tell where the edges of the screen are. And he's also got the lighting fading out as it gets further upstage, so that all becomes a sort of dark void that we can't really put our fingers on. And then a little bit later in that same sequence, we have some video animating the portal pieces back further and further, so it looks like the video wall is tracking upstage, and it's actually just the content that's doing it. And it creates a very powerful illusion that the stage has, 10 or so meters more depth than it actually does. All right, so that takes us to some communication with the costume designer. Again, I put there the idea of communicating about the overall design, and what that mostly has to do with in the costume designer is keeping a tab on colors and patterns. Since the projection surfaces are usually located upstage or surrounding the costumes, we'll want to be very careful about the color balances that we're making. If you've got a big orange background in the video wall and then the characters are also dressed in orange, they're going to just disappear inside of that. So you want to be careful and sensitive to the color choices made in the costumes, and see if you can have your imagery working together with those choices to make it a stronger picture. And frequently, the costume designer will have sketches of their ideas well in advance, so you can use those to work from. A big thing that you'll run into frequently if you're doing a lot of big shows is these pre-recorded shoots, right? So you've got these shoots that involve actors, and you're doing shooting before the show goes into tech. And as I mentioned before, you need a lot of help in getting these things together from the costume and wig department. And you'll have to get those conversations started as early as possible so issues of scheduling and workflow can be addressed. Are the costumes that you need for the shoot the same ones as in the show? If so, like I've said, you'll probably want to leave those shoots until later in the process so you can make sure that those costumes have made their way on stage and being seen under light. And so any changes that might need to be made to those costumes will have been made before you go and do your final shoots. On the other hand, if the costumes are unique to the video shoot that you're doing, then you want to make sure that they're aware of them in the costume department, right? They might not be listed in the script, and so the costume department might not even be aware that those costumes are needed, and that's adding more costumes, creating more budgetary restraints, and adding to the workload of the costume department. So you want to be very sensitive to that, and you want to make sure that you're talking about that as soon as you're aware of any of that. And frequently a lot of those shoots are done on green screens, so it's also important to know that with green screens and blue screens even, you're going to run into issues that are specific to that type of technology. So here are 2 images of costume issues that were specific to green screens, right? So on the top here image, you have these 3 characters that are 3 actors all performing the same role. So we were shooting the understudies at the same time as we were shooting the main actor. But you'll see the camo in their pants is all various shades of green. So those become a real problem when you're trying to key them out in post-production. Ideally for that shoot, you're using a blue screen, and we just weren't in a position to be able to do that. And so what we needed to do was, as part of the setup of that green screen, we needed to make sure that before the actors showed up that we had lit it in such a way that we could get a clean key and get rid of that background against those very close shades of green surrounding their pants. In the same way the guy below, right? So he's got that laurel leaf crown, and you just want to make sure that if the character does in fact need to wear that, that you can get a clean key outside of that. And so we chose to put him in a place where the lighting on the green screen was a little brighter, so the green itself, red, is a little lighter, and we were able to pull a stronger key against that dark green. Next, we're moving on to the sound designer. And again, this is somebody who you're going to share a lot of work with in the transition and sound effects, and if you've been doing these pre-records of various pieces, they might have dialogue with them, and you're going to want to make sure to have recorded that dialogue so that you can have a clean playback during the show. And so in doing that, you're going to want to have a clear system for syncing stuff, right? So of course that means you want to have slates for all the videos that you're shooting, and then you also want to be recording that audio separately. So in a lot of these shoots, you're going to want somebody from the sound department there recording their own sound. I find it is never a good idea for somebody from the video department to record the sound on these things. And then once you get to the editing, you'll use these slates to line everything up, and then you'll come out with the tracks that you need for the show. That brings us to control and cueing. Simply timecode is a great way to allow the sound department to drive a sequence. Which we frequently use it in musicals and other scenarios in which a whole sequence will be exactly the same timing every night. It allows us to keep the music and the video image and sometimes the lighting all perfectly in sync in a frame accurate scenario. MIDI notes, OSC, and MIDI show control are also used to trigger things between the two departments. I want to quickly go over some stuff with the production manager, as they are the sort of interdepartmental nexus for all communication. You know, your production management team is going to be responsible for doing all problem solving, helping you with budgets, getting things all lined up with the vendors. They're also responsible for personnel and equipment in regards to load in and any sort of schedules for work calls and things like that. And then ultimately be responsible for the maintenance of the equipment too. So it's really important to have open channels with them, because I really consider the production management team the folks who are going to help me solve all my problems. That brings us to the stage management team, who are also responsible for organization and scheduling, more on the side of the rehearsals and the acting company. But it's important that you have open lines of communication with them in regards to anything you may need for shoots and all that, but also to make sure that they have all the information they need for the cueing. So as you'll see here, I've added a very small section of a cue sheet for us. And even though the stage management team isn't necessarily calling our cues, it's important that they know where the cues are placed and which lighting cues may be triggering video. He or she will be watching the show and watching the stage picture change and the cues that trigger them. So it's important that they understand what is happening in order to know if those cues are firing properly. And so that covers most of the communication that we need to talk about. Like I said, it's really just about keeping the lines open mostly and sharing the ideas between the departments to make sure everybody's on the same page. All right, and that takes us to the second section where we'll talk about the projection team. So here's a very basic layout diagram of the projection team for a large Broadway show. And it might seem like a lot of people, but given the significant needs of a big show, the intense timetable, and the profile of the show itself, it's very important to properly staff the team so that everybody can focus on the job they're doing. But who we're going to talk about first is the associate designer, and then we're going to talk about the animators and editors, also talk about programmer, and then the production video. And this is a kind of, this diagram sort of shows the way that communication and information is dispersed. Everything that comes through me should go to the associate designer. It doesn't mean that the associate designer is the only person, talking to all these departments, but it just means that they need to be aware of everything that I'm doing and all of the ideas and the needs that I have as the designer. You know, there's nothing more frustrating for an associate than to hear one thing from me and something else from the animators that may have been talking to me just 5 minutes before. So it's important that you keep your associate up to date on everything that's going on so they can accurately and appropriately help what you need to get done. The associate is my main collaborator. It's the person with whom I work hand in hand from the beginning on every aspect of the show. And you know, we'll start with the scheduling and planning, but this can include things like a shared calendar with rehearsal and performance times, info about any shoots. Deadlines can also be in that calendar, super useful. You can have email and text reminders set up, something that my associate can do for me as part of this system. Just as far as software is concerned, we use Google Calendars, we use Airtable, and we also use Slack very significantly once we get into the production, and everybody on the team is constantly talking back and forth in Slack, so we can keep all that information in one app, and we can also go back and check on things as they've come along in the past. My associate is also a huge part of the creative process. He's with me every step of the way, and in some cases that means that he is taking a first pass at some of the storyboards and some of the content ideas. In some cases it means he's taking meetings with the director or the scenic designer when I can't be there, managing the team when I can't, right? So it's important to remember that a design team can be anywhere from 1 to 10 plus people. And in those larger versions, we're essentially a small business with dynamics and system of our own as we participate in a larger production. So there's personalities, individual needs, questions, problems, disagreements. All these things happen within the department as well as within the show. So content and file management is something that's also very important, right? So this job frequently gets overlooked, but I find that it's an important element within the integrity of the show. We've all gotten lost in a disorganized jumble of files, but to do that in the middle of tech on a big production can be disastrous. What you'll see here are two sets of folder structures. On the left is the folder structure for our internal documents, for admin and systems folders that we keep track of amongst our own team. And these are both templates, so these structures are used in every project. On the right hand, you'll see a folder structure for what we call the studio, which is the creation of the media. And this folder structure is replicated exactly on every computer in the projection team. So you can get on any computer and you'll see this exact same folder structure, all updated, all in real time, synced from every machine so that everybody can look at everything at the same time. Similarly, we have templates for After Effects that have been created by my associate. I should mention his name is Simon Harding, and we've been working together for many years now. And we've done a lot of great work together, many shows. He's been able to create a lot of this stuff that's become very, very useful and specific to our needs in the shows that we work on. So on the left here, you'll see these various buttons that do shortcuts and macros within After Effects that are specific to our needs for copying, versioning, retiming compositions, renaming compositions, adding channels. Channels are the words that we use to describe a surface, so any single channel is a surface or a set of surfaces. And then there's a bunch of information here, macros for render commands and stuff like that. On the right, you'll see the breakdown of file naming structure that we use. Some people get really interested in this sort of thing. First 3 digits represent the act and the scene, and the first digit is the act, and the second 2 are the scene number. The second set of 3 digits is an individual number to this particular file, so that's created by the animator. The third set of letter and 2 digits are the channel or surface number, so we know where this piece of media goes on the stage, what channel, what surface it's meant for. And that's a useful piece of information for the programmer to have, right? So they can look at that number and know exactly what that content is for. And then the text is just a name that you can have. So each piece of media has its individual name. And then the version, of course, nobody's going to get it right in the first version. So we make sure to track all of these versions and have all of them available within After Effects, so we know where we are, which one we're using, where we're going next. So the animators, the content creators, what are they doing? They're taking the rough ideas that we have and we're turning them into show-ready content. And we went over some of that in the creative process. I'll show you a little bit more on sort of the making of the scene here. So I started with these pencil sketches on the left, handed it to my animator. We came up together with these still images on the right as a sort of idea for the look of it and the feel of the whole aesthetic of the section. And then he started making some 3D animations of planes and sent me these wireframe versions of those things so I could have a look at them and start giving some feedback on what that was and how it looked and how it played into the scene. And then we made this larger piece that is the actual sequence. So this is a storyboard that we've made in After Effects that utilizes all of the channel structures that we talked about and the wireframe animations that he made in the 3D software. We then imported those into After Effects and fully rendered them and worked that together with some two-dimensional sky. And so now we've got this more full representation, storyboard of the content to show to the director and the scenic designer and have a look at what that is. Now, of course, the minute you get into the theater, all that's going to change. But that's an idea of what we're working on. The other thing that you really want to make sure that you ask your animators to do is once you get into the theater, I really like to encourage them to keep their head up every now and then and have a look, especially if it's scenes that they're working on. You want to make sure that they watch how they're going. Sometimes animators can just get their head in the computer and not look up and realize that the show is happening right there in front of them. And you want to make sure that they're watching how it's progressing on stage, seeing what the imagery does next to the performers in interaction with the scenery and the lighting, and let them have more ideas, right? They're going to have a very intimate knowledge of this content, and you want to really welcome their ideas and their input as you turn this stuff into the final show. And that brings us to the programmer. We'll start with talking about the setup and the prep of the media server. Many media servers now, like Disguise, allow you to utilize 3D models and work within a 3D environment. So on the left here you'll see a picture of the model setup for Tina and how we use that, and the programmer was responsible for getting all that set up and ready before we came into the theater. On the right you'll see some previs models running, previs images running through that same model that allowed us to look at some cues before we got into the theater also. It's important to remember that these media servers are just tools to do the job. Some of them have more bells and whistles than others, but ultimately the design is not hampered by the quality or the type of media server. You can still get a lot of things done with all types of servers. And programming the show, so this doesn't just involve adding cues, it also involves things like keeping a clean programming environment, if that's a timeline, making sure that you have things orderly, software and hardware updates for the system integrity of the computers and servers running that system. Next is system integration with other departments. We've spoken about this a little as we talked about design and communication, but what you want to be aware of is that there are all sorts of protocols that are running information back and forth between different departments and their gear, and then within the gear within our own environment. So within a projection design system, you can use OSC, ArtNet, and other protocols just within our own equipment, and then things like MSC, MIDI notes, OSC, streaming ACN can be used with the lighting interactions, SMPTE, MIDI, OSC, and MSC can also be used in working with the audio department. And then we'll take positioning data from the automation team so that we can see where the pieces of scenery are in the 3D environment that we've created. There's also other sensor data that you can get from things like black tracks and other generic sensors that can be used to keep track of where cameras are and things like that for both positioning purposes and safety needs if necessary. That takes us to the content management system, right? So whatever we've created as the projection design content team, we want to make sure the programmer is up to date on what that system is so that there's a streamlined flow between the content creation and getting it onto the servers. You also want to make sure that the programmer is aware of versioning choices and changes as you're going along and making updates, and then brand new content as it comes across. So you just want to make sure that you have things in place for all of those lines of communication so that everybody's on the same page as you're moving through tech. And that brings us to archive and prep for the run. Another thing that the programmer is very helpful in doing is creating systems for pre-show tests and system maintenance so that all that stuff is taken care of on a daily basis, and then also over longer runs so that you have schedules and things in place for making sure that the system as a whole and the server in particular are healthy and running as needed. Frequently we'll use redundant backup systems, so having main and backup systems in place and functioning is also a very important part of that role. And that takes us to the production video person, who is essentially our version of a master electrician or a technical director. She or he will take care of the implementation and the maintenance of all the technical items in the projection world. And that'll start from securing the equipment. And I generally will give my production video person a very general list of equipment, and they'll take my simple list and turn it into something more comprehensive, like you see here on the right. And this is helpful to me because it allows me to give general sort of overall impressions to my production video person, and then they can take that and turn it into a system that they're comfortable with and that they feel strongly about in the minutiae of that system. You really don't want to get into a place, I've found, where you're forcing a production video to use specific gear unless it's really imperative for the design to be fulfilled. Otherwise, you might be asking them to use equipment or system components that they're not really comfortable with. So as much as possible, you want to leave that minutia to them so that they have a system that they feel strongly about and really can control and maintain. Production system will involve all sorts of things like display devices, projectors, and LED walls, TVs, etc., the media servers themselves, signal cable, but also it involves the power distribution, and then the networks. Our production systems now use a lot of network information back and forth, and that's within the projection world specifically, but it's within all departments in general too. So we generally have our own network system that we can then coordinate with other teams and keep everything talking to each other smoothly. Also any cameras that you might need for within the production, but also to do tech recordings and things like that. All of those things will be organized by the production video person. And then similarly to the programmer, they will work hand in hand with the production video person to make sure that all of the show checks and everything for the system maintenance is up and running. And then that will be on a nightly basis, but that will also transfer into maintenance calls for the long term to do things like change lamps, fix LED tiles, and periodic checkups that need to happen in addition to the nightly things that come up that need to get fixed immediately. So that's the sort of larger picture of the projection team as a whole, and then getting into some of the bits of each individual role and what they do for us. All right, so that takes us to section 3, which is preparation. And the first section of this is the equipment choosing, right? So one thing to keep in mind as we go over all of these sections of preparation is that all of these topics is that from a timeline perspective, a lot of this overlaps, right? And it all informs the other topics. So your equipment choice will be informed by the theater into which you are putting the show. And the way that the equipment interacts with the other departments will possibly force you to find new gear. So I'm describing these in a particular order, but don't think of this as a rigid order of events. Think of it more as an evolving puzzle. And all of these individual elements are simply part of that larger picture. And with most of these elements in the theater, the key to success is communication and clarity. So the equipment you're choosing, right? What are the display devices? What are the media servers? Or do you need cameras? And what's this distribution? So the main constraints in all of this, of course, are budget, space, and then the aesthetic. So what I've found is it's best to kind of start with your aesthetic goals and then work backwards through the space and the budget. But the display devices, you want to ask yourself, are we going to use projectors? Do we have room to go with front projection, or do we want rear projection? Are we using screens to put the image on, or are we doing projection mapping? Are we going to use LED tiles? Do we want to use TV monitors? Do we want to do arrays of TV monitors? So all of those questions are going to be answered by what the show needs, right? And then once you go back and figure out what you want in the show, then you can figure out, does your budget allow you to get it? And you can make those cuts and restraints as needed. The media servers are really something that's up to the individual. And again, budget does come into play. The media server is a tool. Like all of these things, you can want and worry about getting the coolest, fanciest new item, but what really matters is what you do with those tools and the content that you create and how you integrate it into the show. So I found that it's really important for me to remember that I have to work within the budgetary constraints that are given to me, and then I can still make the best show out of that. Like, just because I have a small budget doesn't mean I can't make a good show. Cameras are something to think about. A lot of people use cameras in the live performance, but you'll also need to think about if you're using them for pre-recorded content. Do you own those cameras? Do you need to rent them? And what kind of shooting equipment you'll need for that as well. The distribution system, it doesn't just mean signal distribution, it also means power. You have to get power to all these devices, including to your tech table, so you want to make sure that you have that properly distributed and the proper voltage for all of those devices. And then of course the signal distribution, but that can be more complicated too. What type of signal are you pushing? How long are the distances between these devices? Can that type of signal go that far? Can it go across that type of cable? You know, a lot of us are using fiber at this point to push things around, both network and signal, and that gives you a lot of options for signal changing at the locations. Do one big fiber distribution and then you have your network and your signal all running through that. But that's a very expensive infrastructure. So as you go around running things like HDMI or DVI, you want to be mindful of how far those go and are they appropriate for the resolutions that you're trying to use. And that does take us then to network distribution. All these computers, projectors, the cameras, the servers, all these things are connected and controlled over a network. Even on small gigs where you have a laptop and 2 projectors, these networks are pretty crucial to the show. And so you want to be mindful of how those are made. And I just always want to bring them in myself, have my own network running the show and not be reliant on theater equipment to do that. So fitting into the rig. So to me, this is about the specifics of the theater and the theater space, the size, the depth, the height, and what is your ideal for getting your aesthetic choices and your design into that theater. And then you want to share the space with the other department, right? So here's an example from Tina when we first were talking about doing it in London. And you'll see there's a big screen on the upstage side of this. And originally we had planned to do it with one rear projector. And it became clear very quickly that because of the space, we were going to need an ultra short throw lens. And it was really the only choice that would allow us to fill that screen given the parameters of the space. But we also realized that we wouldn't be getting very much punch out of that lens, and the versatility that we would need was very limited. That screen needs to fly, things need to pass in front of it and behind it, and we just weren't going to be able to get the effect and the versatility of that product that we needed. So we switched to LED tiles, which was probably one of the best design choices I've ever made, definitely on that show. That takes us over to drawings. So the first part about the drawings is ground plans and sections, and you'll want to use these to show beam angle, to show placement, to show coverage. But again, it's about getting the math done for you and your team so everybody knows how this stuff is working, but it's also about sharing these things with other departments so that they're aware of where your equipment needs to go. You know, the 8 feet at the center of a balcony rail is a very popular set of square footage in a theater, and so to ask for 2 projectors to go there and 3 cameras, that's a big ask, and so you want to make sure that everybody on the different design teams is aware of those needs, and that you can put them there, that you can baffle the noise of them there, and that you can control the sight lines around them. So things like that need to be managed from very early on, and you need to have open communication about all of that. That takes us to systems diagrams, which are really more for your team. I really feel like there's 2 versions of systems diagrams. This first one is a very simple drawing, and it's intended for a small production and allows for room for perhaps inexperienced crew members so that you have sort of more pictures of the things, and they can say, oh, that's the projector, that's the little thing that goes in front of the projector, those are the servers, and they hook to this monitor and hook to this mouse, and it's a very clear layout. Lets you have those inexperienced crew members help you put this stuff together. So this next one is a pretty comprehensive schematic for the whole TINA system. This gives you the layout of the whole thing, including the racks and stuff. Now there's some additional connections inside of the racks that aren't drawn here, but what this does is let you kind of see the whole overview, make sure you have all the components you need and the functionality as a system. And then there's minutia inside of that that you don't necessarily need to see on this diagram, but is useful down the road. So this slide is showing some of the network infrastructure, and as I mentioned, the networks are now becoming the backbone of many projection systems, and so this distribution has become very important. The base distribution itself is usually on a fiber network, and then these various managed switches are located all over the theater, supplying data ports but also supplying signal ports. And so each of the ports on these switches is for a specific function, and so you can't just go around plugging anything in anywhere. It's all very specifically configured. So maps of those switches obviously becomes very important as well. So testing is another part of the preparation, and sometimes people feel like they can't do this because it costs money to test, and that's not always true. And I think it's really important to bring it up because a lot of times you're going to be using new technology, or you might be using older technology that you're familiar with in a new way, and you want to really have a look at what it does before you get it into the theater. So in these 2 images here, what you're seeing is on the left is an LED wall that we're testing that was probably a lower pitch wall, probably around 15 or something, and we wanted to test what it would look like as a bare wall, and then what it would look like with some rear projection screen in front of it to try to soften it and get an idea. And so there's an example of 2 different substrates in front of that screen, so we could really see what they looked like. And you know, this is the kind of thing that you want to test on a 1 by 2 meter piece of RP screen before you go out and buy a 10 by 12 meters sheet. On the right, similarly, we're testing some LED wall against a front projected image, right, to see the brightness relationship and to also see how it looks on the screen versus how it looks on that low resolution LED wall. And that brings us to the end of section 3, preparation. All of these things that we've discussed in this section are really just setting you up to be as ready as possible for the moment that you walk into the theater. Getting the equipment lined up, doing your drawings, and getting all these tests made and the content prepped are just tools so that when you walk in, you can be an artist working among other artists to make the best piece of theater possible. All right, so that brings us to section 4, which is the summary, and just a little brief discussion of some of my experiences that might be useful to others. Kind of a common thread that's been going through the whole thing is communication. And I feel like it's really important to keep the lines of communication open between people on your team and with other departments in the production. You want to share openly about your design. You want to share openly about the content you're making and the steps of making that content. And I really feel like it's important to share your problems too. You want to, as you come up against hurdles, whether it be within your own department or in the show at large, you want to share openly about those because it's a lot easier to get solutions to that if you have other people's help. And then for the projection team in general, I really think it's important to find a structure that works for you. Like I said, there's a lot of us out there with various organizational practices as far as personnel and as far as file structure and organization, with every element of how we create content and then interact with other designers. But I think you can kind of pick and choose what you learn from me in these lectures and from others that you've watched or participated with, and really make a system that works for yourself. And then the last thing is just prep. You know, it's really important to get all your ducks in a row, to get as much as you can done as early as possible. Obviously with drawings and equipment choices and things like that, there are deadlines that are very important. But also with content, you just want to be as ready as you can. You know, I'll walk into a text sometimes and have first drafts of all the stuff and feel really strong about the ideas. And then you'll start going through the first day and everything that you've made will get thrown out the window. And I expect that at this point. And so it's really important to walk into the theater with as much stuff as you can and have as much ideas on the table as possible. Just as far as my experience over the years and some things that I think are useful to know, I think it's really important to show your work in the early stages. When I was a young designer, I was very reluctant to show directors or other designers any content that I had or really openly share about those ideas until it was what I considered to be finished. And it became clear to me that that was really detrimental. It was detrimental to me as a designer, and it was detrimental to me as an artist within participating in the show. And what I found is that the more I can share the ideas from their inception, from those pencil sketches to the early storyboards, and even the early research images that are inspiring me, the more that stuff gets shared, the more powerful the collaboration is. And you know, especially with research and early sketches, if you show those to a director and they're not interested in the direction you're going, you want to know that early on. And if, like in my early days, you want to wait until you have all the content done and made perfect, then you're going to have put in a lot of work that will ultimately be wasted time when you show that to some director who thinks you're going down the wrong path. So share that stuff and share it early and keep those lines of communication open. I feel like along those lines, it's really important to keep all the ideas on the table, and even all those things that I would consider to be bad ideas, I feel like are important to say out loud and to get them into the room. You never know what's going to inspire another designer or a director or someone else on your team to do something else and to have a better idea. So you really want to keep those things floating and promote a spirit of creativity and collaboration. And then it's also, you know, become very clear that you can't always get it right. And so it's important to remember that I want to be willing to be wrong. And I want to be willing to put my idea out there and have it not be the one that's chosen. Main essence of a collaboration is that it's a whole bunch of people working together towards a common goal. And if I am just walking into the room with the sole intention of having my ideas and my design be the winner, then it's not really in the collaborative spirit, and it's ultimately not in service to the show. So I think it's important to be willing to put your ideas out there, to be wrong about things, to have your ideas not be the ones that are chosen, and to still keep bringing the creativity into the space to really have a collaboration and a strong bond of artists making the work together. And that's all we have for today. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you in lecture number 3.